Hello, class. I hope you're all having a wonderful week. So, for this week's discussion, I went onto the JSTOR database and I continued my research in the War of 1812 and have found three very fascinating articles that not only contribute to the study of the War of 1812, but also give some new angles and perspectives of how the war has been remembered and what has been researched and what could be further touched on later on. One that stood out was Robert S. Allen's His Majesty's Indian Allies, Native Peoples, and the British Crown in the War of 1812. So Allen observes the history of the native alliances between the Native Americans and the British government between the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. He looks at the different treaties that were signed, such as the Treaty of Greenville, signed in 1793, and he looks at the different documents that were written between the Native American tribes and the British Crown to show how the alliances worked, what triggered them, and their long-lasting impact on American history. And his overall conclusion was that the War of 1812 ended any grand alliance between the Native Americans and the British Crown, and it dashed any hopes of them holding on to their original territory as the United States kept expanding westward. So this is a good example of the War of 1812, not only from the British perspective, but from the Native American perspective as well, since the Native Americans are often portrayed as the losers of the War of 1812. Now, another one that was a good one to look at was Donald R. Hickey's article called "The War of 1812: Still a Forgotten Conflict." Now, Donald Hickey is usually referred to as one of the leading experts on the War of 1812, even though there are many historians studying the War of 1812 these days. And so Hickey continued his study from the book he wrote in the 1980s called The War of 1812, A Forgotten Conflict. Now with this, he looks through the different aspects of the war, including military, political, and civilian. He looks a little at the Canadian side, the British side, the Native side, and looks at anything that needs further study for the War of 1812. And he looks at different documents, whether it be military journals, political documents, legislation passed from both sides, to calling for military and troop movements, and the different financial accounts that show how the economies are doing, and civilian records, and letters, and all sorts of journals that have been written about the War of 1812. And his conclusion with this is the War of 1812 has been touched on a little bit more since the end of the 20th century, but there are still lots of areas in the war that still need to be reviewed and researched further, including economic hardships, looking at the different states as we looked at last week, looking at the Canadian perspective, the Native perspective, and the British perspective. So there's still much to be done with the War of 1812. Now, the other one I looked at was Harvey Strum's New York Federalists and the Opposition to the War of 1812. He simply looks at not only just the state of New York, but the Federalist Party as a whole, why they opposed the war. He looks at the different legislations that were passed calling for the New York militia, the New England's refusal to show the New England militia, and the documents he shows governor written letters that show the various opposition of why they're not calling them and why they want the Democratic Republicans to end the war as soon as possible. Now, his conclusion was, because of the opposition, the Federalist Party was eventually collapsed right around the end of the war, especially after the disastrous Hartford Convention. Now, with these in mind, these are good articles to look at for this conflict and why the conflict is still worth looking into, especially since the war is still referred to quote Donald Hickey, a forgotten conflict. Thank you all.